I've personally known John Betancourt for more than, I guess, more than 20 years now, and we've done some projects together. But this is someone who's been in the fantasy, pulp, entertainment, publishing sphere for a long time. He published his he sold his first short story at 16, first novel at 17. He was an editor of Weird Tales at 24. And he has done a million things since then and published a lot of stuff. Someone who is really plugged into the industry in so many different ways and knows so much more about it than I will ever know. Would you please welcome our guest of honor, Mr. John Betancourt.
Oh, thank you all for having me. I must say that this is my actually first time being guest of honor anywhere, so I'm completely honored. This was on my bucket list. I never thought anyone would want to have me, but thank you for having me. I appreciate it. I was going to originally show you a video I made while in high school. I was, not high school, in college, because I was a film major, and one of our projects was to make an 8mm film, anything we wanted. And I actually took my little camera and I went to the offices of Amazing Stories, where I was working as an assistant editor. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But I made a documentary film about 10 minutes long about the editing process we used at Amazing Stories. And it was exactly the same process we used when we launched Weird Tales a few years later. So I hope to actually finish that up, get it up on YouTube so you can all see it at some point. I think it's a lot of fun. It is an amateur film, so it's got all the creaky things, the handheld camera, the found footage look that's become so popular lately. But it's a lot of fun. And you'll get to see George Sithers and Daryl Schweitzer and a bunch of other famous editors in it when it actually is up. Unfortunately, my mother had done the narration for it, and it was on a cassette, which has been lost. We actually found it in a bedroom at my parents' house just a few years ago. My brother turned it up, and we got it digitized at Walmart, and it's now an MP4 file, which is inconceivable in the 1980s when it was made, because it's from about 1983, 84, about then. But they weren't able to do the showing here because they didn't have the technical equipment on board to project it behind me, because I would have provided a live narration for it. It would have been cool, but you'll still get to see it. So I'm going to talk about instead how I got involved in science fiction, fantasy, horror, editing, and how Robert E. Howard kept intersecting my life throughout my career, which is really remarkable in so many ways for someone who I hadn't ever had a chance to meet him. I've met most of his contemporaries over the years. El Sprague de Camp was one of them, not a contemporary of his, obviously, but met Fritz Leiber. I've met E. Hoffman Price, Frank Belknap Long. In fact, the first time I met Frank Belknap Long, he shook my hand completely unprompted and said, "You are now one handshake away from H.P. Lovecraft and two handshakes away from Robert E. Howard," which I thought was pretty cool. But anyway, let's back up a little bit. When I was a child, my father was an archaeologist and he worked in Greece. So every year we went to Greece, small towns, middle of nowhere, more donkeys than people, one phone in the village if you're lucky, maybe a television, maybe not. Half the time there wasn't. So what's a kid to do when he's 9, 10, 11 except read? Every year my parents would bring a suitcase full of books, and I would spend the entire summer reading. And unfortunately, I was a fast reader, so I always ran out of books before the summer was over. We were in Crete. I was about 12, 13. Again, in a tiny town called Pisidia, middle of nowhere, more donkeys than people. The big town, Mires, about 20 minutes away, we would go to once a week to pick up supplies for the excavation. They had one stationery store where they would always go, And in the back of the store, the owner showed me one day that he had piles and piles of comic books from the United States from the early 60s, all Archies. Yeah, not that appealing, although I did buy some Jugheads in which he became a superhero, Dr. Hamburger, I believe his name was, and he could have superpowers, and not what I was really interested in. And then another time he had boxes in the back, dust covered, of stuff that they had imported from England. And these were weird stuff. They were strange covers, authors I'd never heard of, Clark Ashton Smith, Jack Vance, people like that. American authors who were published in England and reprinted. And the punctuation was wacky. They had apostrophes instead of quotation marks, but I managed to force my way through them. And I discovered I really loved Michael Moorcock, Clark Ashton Smith, and a bunch of other authors that I'd never heard of before, and that's part of the reason I became interested in science fiction and fantasy. And at age 13, I decided I wanted to be a writer. That was my sole goal in life. I borrowed the Excavations typewriter, and I began writing stories. They were terrible, simply awful, unpublishable, and I'm glad they're all lost. You will never see them. No one will ever see them. They're gone. But I persevered, and by the time I was 15, I discovered the small press. These were small magazines, independently published, because my father, he was sort of aware of the science fiction magazines, because it turned out he wanted to be a science fiction writer in the 50s. Now, this was inconceivable to me. I could not imagine my father, a state archaeologist, who was so strict and rigid and unflexible and not imaginative, wanting to write science fiction. But my mother assured me that yes, indeed, he did want to write science fiction. He'd actually written a really good story about telepathic trees. I cannot imagine this, but apparently so. And so I guess it runs in the family. He actually supported me and let me use his electric typewriter when we got home, showed me manuscript format, which unbelievably he knew and understood, and he actually put postage stamps on my first really awful stories and helped me send them out to plague editors. The editor at Galaxy, Hank Stein, must have realized I was a child, because he sent a very nice, very long letter back that said, you are better off looking at smaller magazines, and he gave me a bunch of addresses and names, and of course I wrote off to them immediately, got sample issues, and sure enough, eventually, stories I sent to these other magazines began to be accepted. And at the time, there was an organization called the Small Press Writers and Artists Organization, and by the time I was 17, I was the president of it. And this is kind of inconceivable at this point that they would elect me as their president at 17 years old. But what did I know? I was a kid. And it was all done by mail, so they didn't actually interact with me or realize how young I was and that I wasn't able to vote or do anything legally, but I would still be the president. The vice president was a guy named Kevin Anderson, who had actually talked me into being his puppet figure and running for president, because he was also 17, and he was the guy who ended up writing all the sequels to Dune and becoming a New York Times bestselling author. So I've known him since I was 17. But anyway, this sort of gave me some false ambitions and false hope, and I discovered that Isaac Asimov's science fiction magazine was being edited in Philadelphia. I lived in New Jersey and began going to the Philadelphia Science Fiction Convention every year, where I finally got up my courage to go and meet George Sithers, my editorial idol, and he was very nice and said, "Pleased to meet you, kid," and moved on. It was not the auspicious editorial break I had hoped for. But one of the assistant editors, who was actually a part-time assistant and full-time dentist, named Henley Lazarus, said, "Oh, if you want to be an editor or a writer, what you actually need to do is edit for George. He will show you how to do everything. And I'm sure he'd love to have you come to his house and be an assistant editor. And of course, he introduced me to George. I said, I'd love to come to your house and read manuscripts and be an assistant editor. And George said, sure, kid, thank you, and moved on. So Henry was kind enough to give me George's address. I had just gotten my driver's license, so I drove out, showed up, and he didn't remember who I was. This kid knocking on his door saying, hi, I'm here to read manuscripts. And, but eventually he let me in, which was his big mistake. I never left. I was there from the early issues of Amazing Stories because he had just been fired from Asimov's and immediately turned around and was hired by Dungeons and Dragons people to do Amazing Stories for them. And so I became an assistant editor at Amazing Stories. Now this was an unpaid job and an uncredited job. Nobody knew I was doing it because they didn't put my name on the masthead. I was like paid under the table in food, which was fine for me. You know, I was just starting college, and it was a lot of fun to take my English class where they would assign you to write a story, and then I could go and give them my bad old submissions and get an A on that because it was an easy A. Anyone who completed it and turned it in got an A, which was nice. And then I ended up spending all of my time, my free time, at George's house, just reading slush. I read hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of stories because George was well known at the time, and he had the advantage over the other magazines in that every time you sent him a story, you would get a reply within a week, and it would be commented on, so you wouldn't just get a form rejection, you would actually get a letter of comment. And he had developed this vast process, which would have been in the film, I wish I could have shown you, where all the assistant editors who read it would leave little notations on a file card, paperclip to the story, and then you would have a stack of maybe a foot or 2 foot high, and you would take your whole stack of rejections with all the comments that all the editors had written, and you would write up a rejection letter using all the comments on the cards. And you typed quickly, because everyone had to type quickly in those days on the manual typewriter he had. And you'd stick it in an envelope, send it back, or if it was good, you'd pass it on to George, and George would read it and make a final decision. And anyway, this is how I got into George's house. George had this tradition called Fourth Friday. So the fourth Friday of every month, he told me, don't go home, because I was getting ready to go home to go ahead and have dinner. And he said, just stay here. We're going to call all the professionals in the area, because it's Fourth Friday. And I said, what's that? And he said, everybody comes. And sure enough, by the time 7 o'clock came, the house had filled with all the local professional science fiction people in the area. That included the DeCamps, Gardner Dozois, John M. Ford, a bunch of others, plus all the people who had ever worked for George, and some oddball characters who he just knew and who showed up. And they would sit around in a giant circle, talking nonstop about everything imaginable except science fiction. Politics, religion, culture, everything imaginable. The DeCamps I got to meet, and I would chat with Catherine DeCamp, who was always there, and Sprague DeCamp, who was very stiff and formal, and very, it's hard to describe Sprague unless you've met him. And if you've met him, you would understand, but he is the archetypal image of the writer. You know, he had his Van Dyke beard, very stiff, very formal military bearing, and he was always have an opinion no matter what. And usually wrong, but not always. But anyway, it turned out that they were looking for authors at one point, and eventually, for some reason, they asked me to write a sample chapter for a Conan novel. Now, of all the British authors and all the American imported authors I had read and encountered from my time in Greece, Robert E. Howard was not one of them. So I had to have a crash course in Robert E. Howard. So I asked Daryl Schweitzer, what should I do? And he told me, read the Carl Edward Wagner anthologies, of the Conan stories that he had put together and edited, because those had gone back to the original text and they were the best things out there. So I read those and I started writing my proposal for a novel. I got one chapter in, and Tor took away the editorship from Catherine DeCamp. So I never got to submit my Conan novel to the DeCamps. But that's one of the first times Robert E. Howard intersected with my life. Another time, when we were editing Weird Tales, jumping forward a few years after George had been fired from Amazing Stories, we decided to stick together as an editorial team with Daryl Schweitzer, George, and me co-editing Weird Tales. And he said, write to this guy, and he gave me Glenn Lord's address, and said, why don't you see if we can get something for Weird Tales from Glenn Lord that's by Robert E. Howard. So I wrote to Glenn Lord, introduced myself, and sure enough, he recommended a poem that had only been published in some fan magazines previously. And we reprinted it, and that's how I interacted again with him. I realize this is the Weird Tales panel, so that ties in with Weird Tales. I've been told I have about 10 minutes to speak, so I'm not quite sure if I'm running too long or not. How am I doing? I can wrap it up. But anyway, I want to thank you so much. This has been a great honor. I've really loved being here, and just keep an eye on YouTube. Look for John Betancourt's Amazing Stories documentary. Eventually it will show up, and you'll get to see how Weird Tales was edited and Amazing Stories was edited. Thank you very much.